All right, folks, welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We've had a great show so far. And for our final segment, we've got Jean Mahan here to talk to us about college finance. And Jean, thank you, first of all, so much for coming on the show. I don't know
You're
if you have an
welcome.
option, if you're like told you have to be on the show, but if you had the option, thank you for, for agreeing
We
to
have the
be on the show.
option.
Perfect. Awesome. And so we're glad to have you. And we want to talk sort
Thank
of about this period of time where we are sort of transitioning from applying for things to starting to wonder what we're going to hear back. So, a lot of families, if I'm correct, October 1st was the first date that they could start filling out the
hmm
FAFSA, right? Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
And so they've been working on their financial aid forms and filling them out over the last several weeks. And then they push the button and it goes off into the nothingness of the internet, and they might wonder what happened. So,
Yeah,
so what is sort of the next step after that submission happens?
sure. So good for them for submitting, getting it out of the way, heading into the holidays without that little dark cloud over your head.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah. So, and if you haven't, you still have plenty of time. So no worries. But what happens is once you submit a FAFSA, it can be anywhere from 3 to 7 business days before you'll get an email saying your student aid report has been processed. And
Okay.
it allows you to go back in and take a peek and see what your family contribution is. And also if there's been any errors. It's also a great time that if you only had room for 10 schools and your students submitting to 15, you can take 5 schools out and add the other 5 in. And then really you're just waiting until your student's accepted and the student and the financial aid office starts reviewing applications. So for students that are applying early decision, they may have a response from the financial aid office in mid-December. For
Hmm.
students who are applying early action or regular decision, it could be anywhere from February to the first few days of April.
Gotcha. And we do often get those questions for families that are applying to more than 10. What do I do? It looks like
Mm,
I can only apply to 10 schools for financial aid. And it is just as simple as going back in and
yes.
adding more schools. And when you delete schools where you've already sent it, the form doesn't get taken away from them. They still have it on file, ready
No.
to be matched
It's
with the file.
so they get it, but if you go in and make changes subsequently,
Hmm.
they won't get those changes. They'd
Okay.
have to go out and look for them. So what we recommend doing is then sending it out again with the second set of schools. Once you get it back, take off those 5 new ones, add the 5 old ones,
Gotcha.
send it out again. So a few extra steps, but for most families, they aren't making any additional changes. It's just that they, are adding schools. So no worries, the school will get it.
And do you get a receipt for a FAFSA when you send it in? Do they send it back and say, okay, your FAFSA has been sent to these schools, or does it just say thank you for your submission?
Well, if you've put the schools on there, the assumption is that they're going, but when you get that student aid report back, you can go in and look to see what schools got it.
Okay, great,
hmm
great. Now, I had Stacy Mack on the show a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the profile. And the profile
Yeah.
being, an entirely different form, asks for different information. Where does that sort of fit in, and what's the process of, getting sort of a receipt for submission for
Right.
the profile?
So what happens is once you hit the button on that, a few days later, you'll get an email from iDoc, which is their documentation system. It'll ask you to upload a copy of your 2019 tax return with schedules and W-2s, and you'll send that in. But
Okay.
after that, it's kind of crickets. You don't really hear anything until the schools start awarding. Most schools will have some sort of a portal where students can check to make sure that, financial aid applications have been received. But it's not, the profile doesn't allow you to go back in and change things electronically in the same way. So if you're adding a school, you can add it and they'll get it. But if you wanted to send additional information or if you made a mistake, you'd have to print it out and send it to all the schools.
Gotcha. And one of the things that Stacy was saying was that active communication with financial aid offices is a really great practice. If you
Mhm.
have questions, if you want to update them, I presume that this could be a time where that would happen. But I also wonder, on the admission side, once the applications are submitted, we have families that come to us and say, what can we do? What can we do? And it's like,
Mhm.
nothing. You just
Right.
have to wait. They're reading your file. Is there an element of sort of just sitting back and waiting from the standpoint of a family? Can there be too much communication with a financial aid office after the forms have been submitted and are checked to be accurate?
Yeah. So, nothing's going to happen until your student's accepted. So calling
Okay.
10 times is not going to help. And in fact, if a financial aid officer starts to recognize your phone number on caller ID, that could be a problem.
Yeah.
So unless you have something new to share or something has come up since you submitted, then there's really nothing more you need to add.
Okay.
In the case of an appeal, that's a little different. Somebody needs to reach out, but most colleges have appeal forms on their website that you can fill out and then just submit to a specific email address.
Okay, perfect. So with respect to these forms, which generally are tied to some sort of formula, whether it's a federal formula or it's an institutional formula, you're just sort of waiting to see what's going to happen and how those awards are going to come to you when you're accepted. But that doesn't mean you have to sit on your hands entirely, right?
Nope.
There are other
Nope.
things that you can do that are connected to the aid process.
Yes.
So what about scholarships? I think that I get questions all the time of what's the right time to look for scholarships? Is there a wrong time to look for scholarships?
No, but there's some times that are more optimal. So if any of our listeners have 9th or 10th graders, get them started now on the search process.
Okay.
There may not be a lot for kids in that age group, but it's good for them to start seeing what's out there. And if they find something that's really amazing and right up their alley, they can bookmark and go back to it later.
Cool.
Scholarship searches are labor intensive. I think people think, well, we'll just find like 3 or 4, but they do a search engine and they get like 150 that they then have to go through and see which ones are the best for their student.
Yeah.
So yes, never too late. Even when they're in school, they should still continue to do those searches.
And what kind of awards are we looking at when we're talking about these private scholarships? I think that sometimes you'll talk to a family and they've got these ideas of, I'm going to get a $15,000 scholarship and this is going to help. What are students typically looking at? And for a student who is motivated and will apply for scholarships, what are some of the best case scenarios that they can anticipate in terms of these private scholarships?
Right. Well, it depends on the scholarship. So local scholarships that you hear about from your high school guidance office, those tend to be a little bit on the smaller side. So I would say they could range anywhere from $300 up to maybe $4,000, in that ballpark. National scholarships, it runs the gamut. So it could be 500, it could be 10,000, it could be 20,000. Really, where I have seen those bigger numbers is from the schools themselves. I don't often see them coming. Maybe I'm just not dealing with the right students, but I don't see that kind of money coming through. I see more often kids coming in with $3,000 or $4,000, $2,000 scholarships. Just because they're a little bit easier to come by, and then scholarships from the school. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but you have to be realistic and think that if they're awarding 10 scholarships and 10,000 kids are applying,
right?
It's going to be a slog.
Yeah, we do that math over on the admission side all the time.
Yeah.
What's the rate? And I think that, if you do some basic math, I would think that a student who's looking at a scholarship database is going to tend to gravitate towards the larger awards. I think that human beings are just going to do that. Oh, this one's 5,000, that one's only 500. But if you can get 10 $500 scholarships, you've got that 5,000 right there.
Exactly.
And so, putting little pieces together, you're paying for books, you're paying for meals,
Yes.
you're starting to put money away that's going to help the cost of college. And, I think, families are often looking at that one shot. How do I get a ton of money on one effort? But it really sounds like it takes a lot of different things together.
Yeah. And I always tell kids, including my own, when they were going through this process, and I know that seniors are fried by the time they submit their applications. So
by now, Jean,
start talking, right? By now, but then to bring up scholarship applications, like, ugh. So I always tell them, if you sit down and you spend, 4 hours looking at scholarships and filling out the applications, and you get $2,000, you just earned $500 an hour. There's no legal way that you can do that as a 17 or 18-year-old. and oftentimes that puts it into context, because I think that for most kids, these numbers are so huge they can't get it. But if they've had a part-time job and they know how long it takes to earn 500, then they're like, yeah, it wasn't so bad. I spent 400. I keep saying 400 hours. No, 4 hours, and got $2,000 in scholarships. So yeah, it can be a good win.
Definitely. And am I correct in my assumption that, when students have income, it fits into the financial aid formula differently from a scholarship award, which doesn't necessarily count? How do scholarships sort of fit into that calculation for student income?
Sure. It doesn't factor in unless they've used it for living expenses. So if they're
Okay.
using it for tuition, fees, room and board, doesn't count. And
Awesome.
students that make less than 7,000, which is the majority of undergrads, that's not being factored into the formula at all. Schools that use the CSS profile, as Stacy might have mentioned, have self-help contributions that range from 1,800 to maybe 2,200. So they expect a student to come up with that either through work, through a loan, I don't know, through their savings account, whatever.
Okay.
So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
So there are some, there are just some considerations that the students might have, but the bottom line is that scholarships tend to be money that doesn't factor into your need eligibility. And so thereby can be really, really great, essentially free money that you can use towards your education.
Many schools are going to require that you report outside scholarships to them. And then you have to look on the school's website as to how they're going to treat it. So some schools will say, we'll reduce your worst loan. Some schools will say, well, we're going to take, you got 2,000, we're taking 2,000 out of our scholarship and replacing it. So it's a wash for the families. It's just that it's not always stackable so that it usually is not going to cover the family contribution.
Is that something that as a family you can do some research at the front end to figure out what that school's policies are towards scholarships?
Yeah. Most schools right on their financial aid page, they talk about scholarships and they'll talk about the treatment of scholarships. If it's vaguish or non-existent, then you can always reach out to the school by email and just say, how do you treat outside scholarships?
Okay.
What impact is it going to have on our aid?
And so the question is, are scholarships stackable or are they sort of absorbed into the financial aid package?
Right.
And if they are absorbed, do they take away the total loan amount or do they cut into that grant money that a student might be awarded?
Right.
Gotcha. Now, financing a college education isn't just about financial aid. There are also different considerations that families might have to make around budgeting and paying the cost of tuition. That first bill comes due the end of next summer. Right?
Yeah, usually August.
Early
August.
What are some things that you can do now to start thinking about getting ready for that first bill?
So figure out if you have any savings, what do you have and how far do you think that can go based on maybe the highest price school that you're looking at.
Okay.
Look at your budget and see, is the mortgage going to be paid off? Is a car loan going to be paid off? We can redirect some money there. Think about the money that your kids are spending that's yours right now. Maybe they're in travel sports or they do expensive camps or they're riding around town in a car and you're paying for insurance and gas. Those things are going away when they go to school. So that money is freed up. I always tell families who have kids going more than 100 miles away to consider taking their kids off the car insurance until they come home again, because that saves money. And that helped when my son was 1,000 miles away. I used that money to pay for airfare. So just redirecting it to other needs that come up. Your kids leave the home, they take their appetites, their friends' appetites, their endless long showers with them. Right. And so there's money that you don't even realize until they're gone that you might be able to use to put on a payment plan or something like that.
Yeah. And every little bit helps. I mean, you just mentioned sort of flights home and just the cost of bringing, a student home. It might be the difference between whether they come home for Thanksgiving or not, putting aside whether they actually want to. And that's a totally different conversation. But, there is a lot of, I think, unexpected costs that might be associated with going to college that families don't necessarily anticipate. Jean, I think that's great. It's just nice to be able to tell families what they can expect and that it's okay to just wait, to sort of be in a holding pattern at this point in time.
Take a moment to breathe.
Take a moment. I love it. Great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Jean.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, that does it for this week's episode of Getting In. We're going to have another great show again next week. The conversation will focus again on essay supplements. We'll be talking about Harvard and Tufts with one of our Boston area experts. We'll also ask the question, is it too late for a senior to apply to college at this point? And spoiler alert, the answer is no, but there's some things you're going to want to do right away. And then we'll talk a little bit about what to do if you're thinking about transferring and how that's going to fit with the financial aid process. So you can see us right here again next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend and take care of each other.